Here's yours.
Oh, thank you.
I think you should have worn your glasses. You might have been able to get a word of truth in that little address you just gave. I do appreciate your coming out tonight to hear a little biography that I'm going to give. It's very personal. I appreciate your attendance very much, and I do wish you to ask questions, thank you, Thomas, if necessary. This is a personal talk I'm giving. CARE was one of the major aid organizations, and still is a major organization, but not nearly as prominent as it used to be. And part of CARE was called CARE Medico. This is devoted to going to overseas to teach the practice of medicine. And this is usually in developing countries where their standard of education wasn't that high. So I was one of the members who did that, and my wife, who was a nurse, usually went along with me. And we spent a month or 6 weeks every year, usually around Christmas time. I'm a Christian, and I can't stand Christmas in this country. It drives me nuts. So we made sure we got away to a non-Christian country in general and enjoyed ourselves very much. Our aim was, not like Médecins Sans Frontières, not to treat people. The aim was to teach doctors in their own country how to practice medicine according to our Western standards. And this worked very effectively, we found. In the course of which, of course, we picked up a great deal of knowledge about the country, enjoyed ourselves very much, enriched our life, and really it was a most rewarding type of activity. There was no pay or anything like that. We sort of went as volunteer, as many other people did as well. In addition to that, before going to Afghanistan, Afghanistan, of course, was a magic name in those days. You never heard anything about Afghanistan unless there was a hole in the newspapers and they decided to plug something about Afghanistan into that hole. It was really not important. They just filled up the space. But Afghanistan, just like Australia, everybody knows it's there, but who the hell cares? Anyway, we went out as volunteers and learned a great deal and had a great deal of satisfaction with it. Prior to that, I'd done some work with the Red Cross in Morocco in 1960. I graduated and got my qualifications in 58. With the result, I knew everything about medicine, never had to be conceived. By the time 1960, there wasn't a thing I didn't know about. So they sent me to Morocco, where there were 10,000 women who were paralyzed from drinking contaminated cooking oil. The Americans had a base at that time, and when they withdrew, they sold their engine oil on the market. It was picked up by a couple of developers who bought the engine oil and sold it as cooking oil, which caused paralysis in 10,000 ladies and children. So we were sent by the Red Cross over there to rehabilitate them. And I'd been in Moscow doing some work and a few other cases, but I'd never been as far away as Afghanistan. As I said, Afghanistan was a magic name. You know, we hadn't seen The Man Who Would Be King, the 1975 film, but we did know about the fellow who had an American Puritan, which I'll talk about, not Puritan, Brotherhood fellow, Quaker, who had been there and had tried to be the king of Afghanistan. Anyway, that was the most entrancing thing about that. So we flew over. In those days, you had a 4-engine aircraft. You had to stop a couple of days on the way over and eventually arrived in Kabul, where the American team was. It was an American team because CARE at that time was an American organization. CARE Canada was a subsidiary group, and we didn't have much to say about what went on, but we were quite happy to be part of it. We arrived there a couple of nights before Christmas, were made most welcome, and indeed we felt very welcome because the first thing they did the next night was to load us in a car, take us out in the desert, where they were having a play on the Nativity, and the whole thing was set up. Camels, donkeys, the whole thing, and they had the births there. It made us feel very much at home. The CARE team at that time, they had residents who were there for a couple of years, and then they had specialists such as myself, and what they did is they stockpiled the problems which I could take care of, which they figured, and then when I got there I would take care of them as opposed to an orthopedic surgeon who would look at orthopedic problems, etc., etc., etc. So all in all, there's a continuing program of therapy going on. This is Afghanistan. It's about the size of France. Not quite the same shape, but approximately the same size. As you can see, we have over here the capital, Kabul. Kabul is over there. Kandahar is down here. Herat over here. Up north, Mazar-e-Sharif and Balkh. I'll be talking a little bit about Balkh later on. Now the transport in those days was pretty grim, with the exception there was a highway between Kabul and Kandahar, which the Americans had built because there was an American Air Force station down here which they'd built up. This is all intertwined with the Great Game. The Great Game, which has never stopped, has continued even up today. The Great Game is still carried on. This is the town of Kabul. Here is the center down here. A great many, in those days, in 1967 this was, all of the embassies had their places around Kabul, and down here was the river going through, and down here is the hospital that I went to, the Ibn Sina Hospital. I'll mention the name a little bit later on. Down here was the museum. Over here was the Russian enclave. The Russians had a fair number of people there, although they remained quite invisible. The town itself was very pleasant. There was a large international organization there because aid was the buzzword in those days, and we wanted to send aid over, with the result of all sorts of school teachers and other people like that who were engaged in raising the level of ability in the country. There were a couple of universities had special courses there in English, in mathematics and other things. The French took care of various things. They had their embassy up there and they controlled one part of the university. The Germans were in charge of medical care, and there was a medical care program going on. This was the fellow who, John Harkins, who was supposed to be the king of Afghanistan, the man who went to Afghanistan in the 1820s and 1830s, and he became an employee of the East India Company. Then he gradually worked his way up and was eventually, from his content, he was sort of a doctor. He hadn't had formal training, but that was good enough in those days. And he eventually ended up being in charge of a military organization and went up to the north of India and Afghanistan and planted, as a matter of fact, an American flag on one of the mountains up there. And he was going to be the man who would be king. Eventually that all fell apart, but that was part of the lore that went along with Afghanistan. Gee, we're going to go to the country where the man who would be king. When we came back later on in 1975, when the film came out, I was watching the film with Bill Stevenson, the fellow who wrote Intrepid, and he'd been in Afghan for a number of years, and we criticized the film very thoroughly because I'll talk about Buzkazi in a minute. Afghanistan is an old fortress, as you can see. This Bela Hissa is the castle, the fortress on the hill. This is a typical type of transportation you see there. Horse and wagons, camels, donkeys, etc. But they were beginning to modernize too. This is a fortress on the hill. This is Kabul down here in the district, and the river running through that. It's not a fast-flowing river. Very nice sort of a city in those days, but the first thing I had on looking out of my hospital window in the morning when I began to practice was this sort of a typical scene which we would see. Camels are very important. Camels are really the TTC, Mike, of the area. You might put that in your next column. Thank you. And of course, downtown, there was a fairly modern town. Given 1965, you got the old style bus, the new style bus, and you've got the typical transportation here with the wagon, donkeys, etc. And then at that time, it was very popular for backpackers to go through there. Actually, my son went around the world, and he went through this whole area, went through with a companion, never any problem going around the world. It took 2.5 years, no problem at all. Life was good, it was sound, it was fairly well protected. This is my wife down in the market, Margaret. I'll mention her a few times if you don't mind. Down in the market, and this is the money-changing market. You don't go to the bank, they don't have any banks. You go down to the money changers and they got their money all in little boxes along the front here, and they give you a fair deal when you trade in American dollars and others like that. A very interesting type of activity. The people, of course, are and always have been and always will be aggressive. They don't like strangers. They don't like you coming into their territory. They're a fight to the last in order to preserve what they want to have. This is their way of life. The family associations are remarkable. They trace their family back far more generations than I could possibly chase mine. And in order to make it stick, they have no hesitation as to using their weapons. The CARE team at that time was composed of this lady, Bella Strauss, and a couple of other physicians who were there. And the facilities in the hospital were not prime, but they were suitable, and we could manage quite well. The operating room was adequate. The first thing my wife had to do when she went in, she's an operating room nurse, is to teach them to kill 50 flies. That was the first thing you had to do before they opened up the operating room. The second thing was to repair the electric fittings, because undoubtedly one of the sockets had broken overnight for some reason or other, had to be repaired, and this is part of her job, which she enjoyed very much. The type of disorders we have were the usual type of things you see in these companies. A lot of burns with kids because they do have open fires and the kids somehow or other land up in them. On the other hand, we saw a number of standard diseases which you'd see here, the number of infections, diabetes, hypertension, all of the normal disorders. But one thing we did see a lot of was hydatid cyst. Hydatid cyst, you get the cysts are passed in the dog's feces and somehow or other got into your diet. And you ingest it and you build up this cyst inside your body, which can kill you. You got any wine left? That, of course, is an appropriate statement in this building, isn't it? Who memorably tasted that and said, "My God, that's water, sir." Anyway, the hydatid cyst has to be removed in many cases with a surgical procedure. We did see other things too, a lot of fractures. We did not see much mental disorder. We did not see depressions. It was quite amazing. One of my first jobs, of course, in going there was to examine the staff. Very frequently they'd been there for some time and had built up of various diseases. And in my time with CARE, I sent home a woman with multiple sclerosis, another woman with hyperthyroidism, and all of these things which they had without realizing it until somebody came along with an objective eye. It wasn't a masterful diagnosis, but they could make the diagnosis for that way. The facilities are pretty primitive, as you can see. The men themselves, and we had very few female patients. There was another hospital in the city where only females were seen, but we did see some. And they were a hardy, robust type of person. I'll talk about what they needed later. Very frequently, we saw people with this type of disorder. Now, Afghanistan is on the Silk Road, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is a fellow who came in taking cargo from Far East, taking it towards Iran, Turkey, and other places like that. Very frequently they had no shoes, they'd walk on the bare rocks, or they'd have sandals only, and their skin would break down. It'd be very difficult for them. And this, of course, is a pretty bad case, but that had to be separated from this case, which is leprosy. So you had to make a difference between the two. It depended upon the neurological status and things like that. So you had to make the diagnosis. And we sometimes saw people who'd been involved in fights, etc., and had a fracture of the cranium, and this had to be taken care of in this way. All in all, it was a general good practice. People didn't stay in the hospital that long, but I will talk about that in a moment. We did see a lot of kids with polio who had, this kid over here has a sort of a primitive support on his leg, a polio splint. It was most likely second-hand, wasn't made for him, but it was necessary for him to wear it, and they got along. And the amazing thing is, this kid, of course, he doesn't have crutches, he just got a couple of canes. As you can see, he's pretty badly deformed down here in his leg, so it's difficult for him to walk. Now, what happens to them afterwards? It's all very well for me to go there as a grand surgeon, specialist, etc., and I pronounce, yes, you've got polio, but what happens to that kid 10 years, 15 years from now? It's a consideration which we must look at someday, but I wasn't capable of doing that day. This is a smaller town where you can see things are a good deal more primitive. As you'll notice, it's a male town. You don't see females outside. The typical house in Afghanistan, all over, is a large compound, maybe an acre, with a 9-foot wall all around it, one doorway into it, which leads into an ante-room, or an ante-yard, and then there's another wall around the inner. If you're a visitor, if you're a celebrity at something, an Afghan visitor, you go and you stay on the outside. You do not go on the inside. And the inside, the women are there. They don't have to wear a veil or burqa or anything like that. And that's really the Holy of Holies. The whole family lives in that compound. There's little furniture. There are mattresses which they pull out from their places under the wall at night and sleep on those at night. During the day, the mattresses are put away, and when you eat, you all eat in a circle with a blanket or some sort of a cloth on the floor, and you eat, generally with your hands. Everybody eats together. The feeling of family closeness is fantastic. You just feel they're all wedded together. And this feeling of family continues on and on, goes through the generations. They can trace back their family for 5, 6, 8 generations. Oh yes, Abdul this, Amir that, da-da-da-da-da-da. They know exactly what went on. And that feeling of familiarity with each other, protection of each other, is one of the most outstanding things I ever saw. Saturday is a big, sometimes Friday morning, generally Saturday is a big day of celebration. You go down to the big park and you watch, if you wish, to watch the dog fights. Dog fights are very common. They're betting on the dog fights. These great massive dogs sort of macerate each other. It's rather discouraging. Or you may want to watch Buzkashi. Buzkashi, if any of you did see that film, The Man Who Would Be King, they had a pretty good episode of Buzkashi there. That's where these gentlemen riders, if I may classify them as so, get together and they fight over the headless corpse of a goat, usually, and whoever has the goat and maintains it and carries it across a line, that's the winner. And there is a good deal of competition with it too, as you can see. These fellows are fairly strong, robust people, and it's quite exciting to watch it. You say, well, gee, that's a headless goat, that doesn't seem very nice, but on the other hand, watching it, you can see some of the excitement that goes with it, and the mob around really loves what's going on. North of Kabul, there's a small town by the name of Istalif. Actually, it's been in the news recently. I see there was some military action there, but at that time it's just a small town. We went up and looked at it. Our job was to look at some of the doctors in the outside area too, but of course this didn't have a doctor there, they had a shaman or something like that. But anyway, one of their products which they advertise and sell are these statues that they make up, which are rather nice, a bit of a handicap. In 1839-42, there was quite a tussle going on, and the great game was in full swing. The British authorities visited Sahib Singh here, who was the king, I'll use the king word loosely, of Kabul, in order to persuade him that they should be making arrangements in order to keep the Russians from making any further incursions. The Russians have continually been pushing down from the north. They're looking for a road to India. And of course, India is Britain. That's one of India's major jewels in the crown, so they want to get through there. Singh was cooperated for a while. The English had a large encampment there. But on the other hand, he got into a fight with the English people. They apparently refused to increase his take, as it were. And the two ambassadors for this they weren't ambassadors, the two representatives of the English government were murdered. And the British Army, the East India Company Army, it was the East India Company Army at that time, which was largely composed of British soldiers, some 18,000, had to withdraw, and they went down south to Jalalabad. Here's Kabul here, here's Jalalabad over here, here's the Khyber Pass up over here. And they went down to Jalalabad, where there's a much stronger type of military presence where they'd be held. Of course, when they went down here, they were pretty well slaughtered by the surrounding people, who took no hesitation at all. And of the 18,000 people who tried to go through that particular gas, only a few survived. Some were taken as hostages, the women in particular, before the march began. And only one person actually survived the actual thing, Dr. William Bryden, who eventually staggered into Jalalabad, although he'd been severely cut with the saber he managed. And in order to prevent that, you had a large number of these tribesmen who were then shooting down from above. Now they use what's called a Gerizon. This is a type of handmade rifle which has a much longer barrel on it than does the Brown Bess, which the British were using at that time. The Brown Bess was accurate up to maybe 50 yards. The Gerizon was 200 yards, with the result they could get up on top of the cliffs and shoot down at the people down below, and the people down below didn't have a chance. And at that particular encounter, the 44th Regiment of Foot was decimated down to the last man. One man was saved out of it because he wrapped a flag around his middle. But this was a major defeat as far as the English was concerned, because the king, once again using the name of Kabul, began to make more arrangements with the Russians. Eventually the British had to come back, and the Second Battle of Afghanistan had to change that. Anybody who goes to Afghanistan must go to Balkh. Balkh is at the top of that map, right up here. You have Kabul here, you have Kandahar down here, you have Allahabad over here. Balkh is right up the top, right near the border. Balkh is an old, ancient town. Possibly one of the oldest cities in the world, ranking with Babylon or Nineveh or other places like that. It has been through everything. Balkh has the advantage of being on the Silk Route. The Silk Route goes from Xi'an over here in China, and is part of the route that comes down here and ends up on the Mediterranean, in Iran and other places like that. This Silk Route has been very important for many hundreds of years, and Balkh has been one of the stopping places on the way. With the result, it's sort of like a tourist thing. We've been to Balkh. Everybody's been to Balkh. And indeed, it has remained as such, although it's no longer has that status, because after being ravaged and razed for many times, and I'll go into that, the landscape around Balkh dried up due to hypersalination, and they began to get malaria, and the village sank down pretty much. But it was quite a beautiful town. It still has some remnants of the beauty in the mosques. This is called the Green Mosque, etc., etc. And it's still a center of culture, still a place that you must visit. Indeed, many people did visit it. Alexander the Great visited, well, in the course of his touring around through the world. He had conquered most of the Mediterranean provinces. He conquered Darius of the Persian Empire, and now he was going to the east and trying to get into India. He came in. Thank you. He came in and went up to, fought his way up to Balkh, which is up here in the corner. And up there is the Oxus River. When we stayed in Kabul, we stayed in what was called a guest house. This is where all of the visiting people got together. It was an old house which had been fixed up, and they gave us meals, and we sat down at a common table and traded reminiscences and narratives back and forth about what we'd seen and heard. And one of the tables was a young fellow and his wife for National Geographic. And they were going up, tracing Alexander's path. And they were on their way up to the Oxus. And they had a Land Rover. What was the name of the Land Rover? You know the Land Rover. What was the name of his horse? Alexander's horse.
Bucephalus.
Right, Bucephalus. Thank you, Mike. He had the Land Rover was called Bucephalus. And he followed the course of Alexander up to the... Now, the river Oxus is a river, but Alexander, when he was negotiating peace with the people he had defeated, spotted Roxana. Roxana was the beautiful daughter of one of the local dignitaries. And Alexander pointed out as part of the peace plan, she was to marry him. And she did marry him. It was a great Hollywood event. It wasn't painted at that time, it was painted considerably later. But the village soothsayers and the people who talk in the villages give the stories because you don't have literacy. You have the village talker who keeps things together and talks what's going on. He talked about the wedding, and Alexander's over here, his best friend who he had relations all the time is standing next to him, and this one is over here. And this was painted sometimes later. Alexander eventually went on into India. He took Roxana with him. He went back to Baghdad and died there a few years later. Roxana had his son, another Alexander. Alexander got a lot of names on things. For example, Kandahar was called Alexander before it was changed to Kandahar. So was Herat. That was also called Kandahar. They called Alexander. Anyway, he went back to and died a few years later, and his wife, Roxana, had a child called Alexander. In order to establish her legitimacy to be in Alexander's widow, as she had his first wife terminated, and similarly, as happened so frequently, she herself and her son were terminated a few years later with the natural politics that goes on. And you will find, as I say, there's a lot of blood and gore to this discussion. Those people, you can leave the room if you can't stand the sight of blood. Anyway, that was happened in Balk. That's what it came down to. Following the Greeks coming in, if you look at that little scorecard that I've handed out to you, as you can see, there are at least 10 people who've come in. And the reason why I gave you the scorecard is so difficult to give a straight, one-by-one list of what went on. But I do point out that Alexander's regiment of 300 BC was followed by the Seleucids, who were another tribe of Greeks. Seleucid was one of Alexander's generals, and he stayed in there and remained as a general after that. About 400, they remained there, and things were relatively quiet, and Balk prospered as it always does. And this is a remarkable thing, that in spite of all the hardships that happens in Balk, and for that matter in Afghanistan as a whole, it recovers. That's something I'd like you to bear in mind. It recovers no matter what. Because, as I'll tell you in a moment, the Buddhists took over in 400 AD, and they moved in, and the Greeks' religion, which Alexander had brought with him, was pretty well put in the second place. And the Buddhists remained there. Then in 642, the Arab Empire began with the defeat of all the Persian outposts that were there, and they moved into Balk as well. And they managed to get along with the Buddhists. As a matter of fact, they persuaded the Buddhists to become Islamists. That wasn't too good an investment, because 40 years later, the Buddhists came back, and all the people who had converted to Islam were executed. Seems they missed out with their virgins in heaven, that's what it amounts to. You'll notice that then I pointed out that in 821, the Abbasids came along, then the Safavids. These are all various denominations of Islam. As you'll recall, the Prophet had 4 sons. And they never did agree as to the future of Islamism, Muslimism. And there was constant fighting going back and forth. And this constant fighting meant that at one time one was in charge, another time another was in charge. And it simply was a matter of going back and forth. You'll notice down there I've said the Ghaznavids. They came from the city of Ghazna in just you got Kabul here, Ghazna's down here, and Kandahar's down here. And they remained in there for 40 or 50 years, then they were superseded by somebody else. The real menace was 1229 when Genghis Khan came through, a Mongol of course, had nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with Mohammedanism. He just raped and shot, stabbed everybody he could. And what's more, he made sure that he's going to make it stick. He would put salt on their fields, put salt on their wells, so they could never make a living out of that. The question arises, which I've never been able to find out, is where did he get all the salt? And I've never been able to find that out. I've looked it up and I just can't find it. Anyway, he had his stay, and the village, the town Balkh, and once again we're talking about Balkh, a certain amount in the rest of Afghanistan, but Balkh was the center as far as I'm concerned. They did begin to prosper and did develop some culture, etc., which I'll talk about later. But 100 years later, he was succeeded by his grandson, Tamerlane, who did the same thing. He wrecked the city, burned down everything, killed everybody. He didn't kill everybody because there were enough there left to survive and continue. Then, a century and a half later, there's another group called the Uzbeks. They're from the northern part, north of Afghanistan. They took over. And then Tamerlane was here. He's not a very prepossessing fellow. But the main thing was, in spite of all these things that were happening, somehow or other the Muslim culture was able to produce a great deal of wonderful things. And those things have remained. Now the Persians did contribute a certain amount to the culture, but certainly the Muslim culture, for some reason, I don't know why it happens, maybe this resolution that you have one aim in life and that's all there is to it, there's no other choices, but for example, they devised this machine by which they could tell the stars what the seasons were going to be. Astrolabe it's called. It's still used in a certain amount of people, places. And the Muslims did a lot of anatomical investigation. They were the first people to lay out the muscles of the eye, for example. They were quite concerned because there was a lot of blindness at that time, and they devised a program for the treatment of cataracts. Cataracts, of course, generally fall down here in the lens of your eye and prevent you from seeing clearly. And what they decided to do was to poke at that cataract and shatter it and let it fall down to the bottom of the eye. Now that worked in a certain number of places, certain number of people. Some people didn't get any better, whatever, but it's still done in certain places up in Uzbekistan and other places like that where they don't have the benefit of CARE Medico. But it's still carried on to a certain degree. One of the people who came along, a great-great-grandson of Genghis Khan, was Babur. Babur was once again a killer. He was a Mongol. And he took over Kabul, then took over, he took over Balkh and took over Kabul. Kabul was just a small town, and took over Kandahar. And in spite of the fact that he was a vicious person, he was called the Tiger, that's what the translation of his name was. In spite of that, he loved flowers, he loved women. He had a very large harem, and he built in Kabul a flower garden and his tomb. And when I went to the hospital at Ibn Sina, every morning I would walk by Kabur's tomb and relish the fact that here, 500 years before, this is where this fellow was lying. I'll just go back one so I orient you here properly, I hope. Northeast of Balkh, we have Balkh up here. Up here is called Waziristan. It may strike a familiar note to you because there's a good deal of action going on there these days. It was then called Nuristan because they had all been converted to Muslims. One of their funeral tactics was to make these statues, which was placed up to, instead of a gravestone, they'd put that over the top of the gravestone. And in addition to that, they would enclose these replicas, wood replicas, in order to guide your way into heaven or wherever you were going. The newer standing. They used a lot of wood up there. It was a very wild country. It was just agriculture, had a lot of wood, and they used wooden coffins for burial. The Greek army didn't have much consideration for that. They simply cut these up for firewood and took care and warmed themselves. I had mentioned before about Babur. Here he is here, showing him in all of his glory with all of his very large harem. Nobody knows how many children he had. One of the major concerned things we like to do, and I did it 4 or 5 times, was doing that romantic thing, is going up the Khyber Pass. You went up the Khyber from Kabul, up here through Jalalabad, what I mentioned before, up through the Khyber Pass into Pakistan, into Peshawar, and then down into India. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but these are some pictures we took of the Khyber Pass. What we had was an old Jeep, World War II Jeep, fairly good repair, and here dear Margaret and I, possibly with one other nurse, would take off and we'd drive up. Alone, driving up the Khyber Pass. That's all there's to it. Great fun, gee whiz. One time I saw a stupa, that's a funeral for one of the Mahouds, off in the side, so we drove over to it and sank axle deep in the soft sand. Couldn't get out anyway. What are we going to do? I see a truck coming down the road loaded with Soviet soldiers, flagged them, used my little cockposhavayati, and managed to get along, Eric, with them, and indicated we'd like a little help. So the 40 guys get out of the truck, go over and lift the Jeep up, put it back on the road. Fascinating. But that's what it was like driving on the Khyber. You didn't have anybody shooting at you or anything like that. And of course it was the most romantic but absolutely horrific thing if you did have any trouble. No cell phones, no automobile patrol or anything like that. And you'd meet all sorts of these people who are on the Khyber Pass, moving back and forth. Once again as families, you have the dogs, the goats, the donkeys, the horses, the camels, maybe an elephant or two, depending on how wealthy the family was. And they would stop and they'd have their tea, etc., and you could break in and talk to them. But the driving itself was quite challenging. That's what it comes down to, particularly with an old Jeep like that, because you were a little bit concerned at times. Might break down. You'd have al fresco lunch along the line, no stop-ins where you can buy any food along the way. And to get up to Landi Kotal, which is at the top end of the Khyber, that is just before you get across Pakistan, you had to stop on the way and eat your lunch on the way. It took about 5 hours to drive up. That wasn't driving very fast, because those roads you don't drive very fast, but you're constantly seeing traffic on the road such as this. Fascinating, not unfriendly, but they didn't particularly wave back to you when you waved to them. Being North Americans, we say hi to everybody, but they don't get too much of a resounding back. And of course the place is well fortified along the way. You have to be careful about what you do and what you say. Getting up to the top at Landi Kotal, which is just on the border, this is the greatest arms market in the world. Americans must flock there because you can buy any type of firearm you could possibly want. You buy it on the street, no problems at all. AKs were all the rage in those days, but I'm sure they've got better things to sell now. But on the way there, we saw the first trip we went through, the plaques up on the wall, just as you went into Afghanistan, where the Red Fort was, commemorating each of the battalions or regiments who'd served there in the British occupation. On our last trip, that was our 5th trip up, those plaques were all gone. They were removed, and we'll never know from a historical standpoint what went on. Part of my job as a CARE director was to officiate at some of the activities that were sponsored by CARE. And one of the things was opening of a water point in a town well back up, a 3-hour drive up into the mountains. And what we'd done, we'd put up the money to have a well with a water supply with 8 water points available for people to draw their water from. Before that, they'd drawn their water from a well, which certainly wasn't most satisfactory. And this was a decision that had been made in association with the people, the elders of the community, who agreed that this would be a good idea. Now, don't be fooled there. That woman is an administrator from the government. She's not a local gal. She wouldn't possibly appear in public without a face covering on. My wife naturally got along as well as she could with the local gals. They were all interested in her clothes and what went on back home and that sort of thing. Now, after a 3-hour drive, and after turning on 8 water pipes, it gets to be a little hard when you're older. You stand with your legs crossed like that, I can assure you. There's a good deal of stress going on. I had to make for the washroom as soon as possible, but I had to open them ceremoniously, otherwise the CARE reputation would not have been enhanced. Once again, we're back here, we got Kabul. Over here we have Bamiyan. Bamiyan is a very old settlement. You've heard about it in the news recently. And when we visited there, the statues, the Buddhas, then there still were intact, but they didn't have faces on. The faces had been called up some time ago. Very rough company. We flew in with a Beaver, about 3.5-hour flight, landed on a landing strip, so-called. They chased the camels and the donkeys off before we could land. Very nice. It was a Canadian boy who was piloting the Beaver, and it worked very nicely, I must say. My dear wife, who has polio, couldn't walk very far, so I had to pay out 40 dirhams in order to hire that donkey to take her up. She enjoyed it very much. And this shows the face of the statues. Of course, they're no longer there. They've gone entirely. Once again, we're in Kabul. We're going up the Khyber. We're going up here into Peshawar. We go up into Peshawar. This is after the Russians are still there. The Russians are still there. We have a great many refugees who were taken care of in Peshawar. And these are a bunch of kids who lost their arms and hands, etc., as a result of picking up bombs, etc., which exploded in their hands. Very bright, but you wonder what's going to happen to them. That's one of the difficulties working with an aid program. You say, is this really contributing to the welfare of the country in the long run? It's a question you're continually, it's great fun for us, we enjoy it. My grandson who was with me, he enjoyed meeting the other kids of his age, and it was great. But you have to put it down to what does it mean in the end? Because as you know, the aid business is a big business. And it's not necessarily concerned with the end point of what you deliver. More it's concerned with the activity that goes on here and raising the money, etc. And all of the things that go along with that. But anyway, these kids, we did what we could for them. There is a German orthotic team which works with CARE, so we tried to arrange for them to get to Peshawar to help these kids. Peshawar was the basis of an old military establishment, and it was laid out there. It had been converted into Dean's Hotel. Inside there's a quadrangle with cottages all around. You're sitting in the cottages, beer, 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 and he comes running in with the beer, and that's wonderful. I appreciate that very much. And they have an old-fashioned dining room there. There weren't many people there. It's a hotel. There weren't many people there. They have an old-fashioned dining room with a 3-piece orchestra. Wonderful. The orchestra can play 8 tunes. It plays them over and over and over again. They're all shatishes and other things like that. It was quite an experience. We enjoyed it very much. In Kabul, down at the lower end of the town, I mentioned before, was the museum. The museum was a fascinating place. Of course, this is just the wreckage of it now because it's been plundered and a good many of the things there have been stolen and sold on the black market. But it was very pleasant looking at the things there, and we enjoyed that very much. In addition to doing those things, that's going up the Khyber, we then got around to visiting other places. I mentioned about Peshawar, but I haven't talked about Lashkar-Gah. Lashkar-Gah is down a little north. You've got Kandahar down here. Lashkar-Gah is up there. As a matter of fact, the Canadian troops are there right now. Lashkar-Gah was an area where we went down to bring in a better hospital. Lashkar-Gah was one of the last areas where they had water of a sizable amount in Afghanistan. And working on the basis of the Tennessee Valley Authority, they put a dam into that river and opened it up as a large agricultural area. And it worked pretty well. Unfortunately, they overdosed the area with water, with the result of no longer possible to grow normal crops in it. And recently it's only been used for poppy growing, which is a very reasonable type of activity to do. In the museum, we didn't see it at that time, but since that time, just to illustrate what has gone on in the country, we didn't know these things existed at that time. These beautiful things which have since been exhumed, because there has been archaeological research going on there for a number of years, and only recently have these artifacts been brought to light. For example, this one of a very old is a monument to St. Sybil, or Sybil, who was one of their gods, and this sort of thing shown dug up with a archaeological visit up in the north, up by Balk, as a matter of fact, this type of carving which shows a horse with a unusual type of head on it. And these other things too, these are taken from a book, this is a photograph from a book of, they did have an exhibit in London, and these are the daggers that have been developed at that particular time. This just shows in the early times, amazingly, women did have, when I say amazingly, consider what we consider them now. In those days, they did have a great deal of status. Here's the king, and the queen is sitting next to him, or you can call him Shah, or whatever you like. But anyway, they are the rulers, and she has an equal place to him and stands equally. This is the Greek who's gone to visit a wise man, and the paintings that are done at this time, this is a good 1,200 years old. Absolutely beautiful, far in excess, far greater than the type of art we were seeing in our society at that particular time. The details. This is a hypochondriac who carries all of these charms in order they won't get any particular disease. This is Muhammad, who's being transported to heaven, his heaven. And as you see, the angels are all around, and they've all got wings on. The thing I'm concerned about here is this is a male angel up here, and this one down here is female. As you know, our angels are asexual, which is one reason why I want to go to hell. I just can't see that as being heaven. That's what it amounts to. But I've always been concerned about why we don't. Anyway, we'll talk about it. This is Babur, who's at his office, and he has a fly swatter man up here, and next to him he has a swordsman holding in order to protect him in case anybody assaults him. This is a gentleman who's obviously drunk too much, and just he's being caught short. That's what it amounts to. And I doubt whether he'll be successful. That's what it comes down to. This is the surrender of Kandahar to Babur when he's approaching them. And of course, these fellows down here will most likely be executed because that was the normal thing to do once you've taken over a country. What we see as well in the archaeological findings are these fantastic pieces of jewelry which come from various parts of the country. Gold, lapis lazuli, very commonly found. And I'll talk about the mineral deposits before I finish. But these types of things are indeed quite amazing when you consider Afghanistan is a poor country. What the hell? It's there. Who cares about it? It doesn't come down. What have they got to give us? I don't know. During its time, when I mentioned about when I showed you the various objects they had, which were a great benefit to the country, the various devices they had for measuring blood and things like that, there's a great interest, particularly from the Muslim part, in poetry. Now, poetry has always been a very important part of the Persian civilization and is carried on into the Muslim. And some of the poets are really quite explicit in what they talk about. Some of the major poets were Hafiz, who did a lot of good poetry, and they were succeeded by Taliban poets. And I don't know whether you've seen this most recent book on Taliban poetry, which is quite an eye-opener to me. It's been an anthology drawn up by researchers. You know, the Taliban, they don't have any poetry, but they do have. Here's something from Rumi, 900. My lips got lost on the way to the kiss. That's how drunk I was. Luckily, though, I still connected with the most tender part of her. The moon conceived. What a wild-looking baby we're going to have. It's fair poetry, as you can see. Another one. Great lions can find peace in a cage, but we should only do that as a last resort. So those bars I see that restrain your wings, I guess you won't mind if I pry them open. Now that's pretty hot stuff. I'm going to try that on somebody I know, see if I can do it. Mira, a lot of lady poets, surprisingly, we didn't have, outside of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and a few others about that time, we didn't have that many lady poets. They got into the field from writing novels, Mary Shelley and others like that. That was the breaking in by females into literature in our civilization. But in their civilization, 1,000 years ago, they had female poets. Here's Mira. He left his fingerprints on a glass the earth drinks from. Every religion has studied it. Churches and temples use the geometry of those lines to establish rites and laws and prayers and our ideas of the universe. I guess there's just no telling how out of hand and wonderfully wild things will get when our lips catch up to his. That's pretty nice, you know. I think I might change my religion if that was going on. Now, of course, poetry has been part of our religion, our culture as well. Others have said things. The green-eyed idol looks down over the fields in Nepal and sees a white cross, besides which a broken-hearted woman tends the grave of mad Karoo. Beautiful bit of poetry. But that wasn't written until the early 1900s. Other poetry as well. Kipling, for example. I should save it, but I'll do it now. But his fascinating talk about the Giselle, which I mentioned before, riding down a path as a young fellow, and he's hot by a Giselle costing sixpence, because these were oftentimes manufactured by the owner himself, who would take the loading chamber from a brown bess and put that on this longer barrel, so it was more accurate. And he points out this kid riding down a horse in the British regiment is shot by a sixpence Giselle, 2,000 pounds of education gone. Beautiful concept. And all those things went along with it. When Marco Polo passed through Balkh on his way up the Silk Road, he remarked that Balkh looked pretty good. They had good temples in it, good castles made of granite, and they encouraged him. He then went on up into China and passed by the Peiping Caves and remarked at that time of the bridge that was there. It was in his diary, talking about the bridge along the Peiping Caves. He preceded Sir John Chardin. Sir John Chardin was a Frenchman, Huguenot, who was with the East India Company, went up the same path, went almost all the way up, and turned around and came back. That was in 1600. He wrote a diary about that. It wasn't until 300 years later that Teilhard de Chardin, with Davidson Black of the University of Toronto, discovered Peking Man in the same peeping caves that Marco Polo had observed on the way up. And they announced it to the world that here's where Peking Man or Paping Man came. When I visited there, they had a display case. Teilhard Chardin, Davidson Black were not identified at all. Instead, there was a little piece of paper, Té de Sé, Té de Sé, Té de Sé. There wasn't any recognition of it. But those people who went up that path, that Silk Road, carried culture from one place to another. In carrying that culture, they spread the culture, particularly through Afghanistan. I think the point I want to make is the following. In spite of thousands of years, and I do say thousands of years, even from Sargon, who was there long before the Persian Empire was there, and his empire, the empires come and they go. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that's very appropriate to today, but I won't go into that. But they do come and go. And in spite of the fact they're replaced by another empire, another tribe, in spite of that, the people survive. In spite of that, the Afghanis have survived. In spite of that, they most likely will survive what's going on here. And even though Kipling may say, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet until two strong men stand hand to hand and bring peace to the world. Kipling, of course, was a very evocative speaker. He knew what was going on. Even though he was a sort of doggerel type of poet, he was able to prognosticate what was going on with the British Empire, with the Tommy, and with the soldiers. When I was last in London, last year I think it was, I was having tea. I don't know whether any stay at the Pen Club over there. The Pen Club, that's a Quaker club down by the British Museum. Great place to stay. Cheap. If you get your own bathroom, a little more. Anyway, I had a chat with a lady there, Susanna Steele. She is the poet appointed by the Beaverbrook Foundation to be the official poet for Canadian forces. And she recently had a requiem for Afghanistan for the Canadian soldiers. It was broadcasted from Calgary a few months back. What it pointed out was the soldiers who were there were 10 stones she talked about in the memorial, that they had left an imprint on a country which was still evolving. Thank you very much.
Don't stand down, Charles. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for questions. Charles's eyes are better than mine. He picks the questioner.
Yeah. Charles, you mentioned Susanna Steele. Is she any relation of the granddaughter of the Queen's cowboy or the King's cowboy, John Steele?
Not that I know of. That's her married name. I'm not too sure. I'll ask her that if she's got any cowboys in the house. She's a delightful lady. She's taking her PhD at Sussex University.
There was another one. Thank you. It was a nice chat. I enjoyed it. Just on the, you were saying that they look back 6 or 8 generations for the family, their forebears and such. I just wondered, when they do that, is that going through the male line, or do they enter into the female line as well? Just wondering, I guess, as the size, the practice of polygamy, or you know, having more than one wife or many wives, did that?
I think your question is, if you look back at 6 or 8 centuries, are you looking at the male line or the female line? Is that right, Tom?
No, you say they look back generations.
No.
When they're following their, and they, I mean, as a
unfortunately, even though the women do have a fair place in their society, indeed, one of their most famous poets, I can't use the word poetess anymore, I mean, female poets, she fell in love with the slave of one of her brothers who was a high-ranking official in Bulk. She fell in love with him, and of course you don't do that. So the slave was put in a dungeon, and the female, it was her brother, slit her veins and put her in a room to die. And she wrote one of her most revered poems in blood on the wall. And that was the only recognition females get and that sort of thing. They aren't given any outside. The fact there's a couple of females in the Afghan government now, and I'm not an expert on that, doesn't mean that much. They're token. The simple fact of the matter is, in my opinion, it's going to take a very long time for the country to evolve. We had to have several revolutions and several people killed before we got the status of females, or males for that matter, as we wanted, and that's a long way to go in Afghanistan. As Bob Ray said, you can't export democracy. Sir.
Charles, when was the Taliban formed? When did they come into the picture?
They came into the picture about 20 years ago. Their major influence from 1994 or 92 up until the turn of the century. Basically, they were a religious outfit who were concerned about the amount of corruption that was going on in the government. And they stuck to the principles of Sharia, that you must be honest, etc., etc., etc. And they then decided to invade the country and put things back on the straight path according to Islam doctrines. And they were very successful. And they had a group of zealots who believed in the Sharia and were great fighters, and the opposing group were really not that powerful, full of corruption. They moved in, and of course, as ever happens all the time, the pendulum swung too far, and they became so much absorbed with power that they lost their basic principles. They are still very active, as you know, but I'm not an expert in that, I know. But I know that as soon as the troops drop out they'll take over. Now, it'll then be, in my opinion, up to the people to stop it. I mean, you get the government you deserve. If they want the Taliban, they'll stay there. If they don't want the Taliban, they'll throw them out. Now, I was rather impressed with them because the Mujahideen, who had sprung up to combat the Russians, were not necessarily that much better than some of the people they were fighting. There's an excellent interview published recently. The Russians have a museum, a Afghanistan museum in Moscow. I don't know whether you've seen it. And the fellow who runs the museum, government museum, has all the artifacts from the Afghan war. And you go in, the fellow was interviewing and said, I see this, I see this, I see this. And he said to the fellow who is a veteran of the Afghan war, have you any advice to give to me as an American as to what we should do? And the fellow looked at him and said, well, we were in Afghanistan for 9 years. You've been there for 12 years. I can't give you any advice. Yes, Eric.
Charles, you mentioned the man who would be king several times, always sort of imperfectly. It's one of my favorite movies. But without provoking a second lecture, what issues do you take with it? Give me the fast overview critique.
With the movie?
Yeah. Apart from the fact
a memorable movie.
5 miles beyond.
I remember when, who's the star of Lawrence? What's his name?
Michael Caine.
It wasn't, as you know, you heard the classic remark about that by the English satirist, who said it shouldn't have been called Lawrence of, it should not have been called Lawrence of Arabia. It should have been called Florence of Arabia. On the basis of the thing I remember about that was, what's his name, Michael, was standing by this beautiful Afghani woman, and Michael Connors came into the room, and Michael said to him, thank God you've come. I thought that was the highlight in the movie.
Have we any more questions?
None on it there.
Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it very much.
On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening to us today. Watch for announcements of future event transcripts, and we hope that you will be able to join us in person for our regular speakers events. Once again, thank you for tuning into our podcasts, and have a wonderful day.